The tragic reality of our world is that 1.4 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day, suffering in conditions of extreme poverty. Without infrastructure or money to pay for basic necessities, the people of developing countries constantly face disease, malnourishment, squalid living conditions, and more. It is for this reason, for these men, women, and children, that I stand resolved. Developing countries ought to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection. Now, in order to ensure clarity in the round, I will define the following terms. Developing countries. Countries with an average income of less than $12,736 a year are classified as developing countries according to the World Bank. To put that in perspective, America's average income measured by that same standard is around $55,000 a year. Economic growth. Economic growth is operationally defined as increasing the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services, as measured by both GDP and GPC. Environmental protection. Environmental protection is operationally defined as policies aimed at protecting the natural environment from destruction and pollution. Value. Quality of life. In a value debate, we have a choice between two concepts, and as such, we need a way to determine which concept is best. That's what a value says. It says that whichever side of this resolution best meets the standard should win this round. The value I'd like to propose is quality of life, defined operationally as the health and welfare of a people in a society. The reason I want you to use this value, you can write down as value link, purpose of development. Because we're dealing in the context of developing countries, we have to establish a goal for them. That's exactly what the value of quality of life provides. It says that countries should do what they can to better their citizens' lives instead of ignoring them. I'm going to prove to you that economic growth is a better way to boost quality of life than environmental protection. This starts with contention 1. Economic growth improves quality of life. Given how many people in developing nations live in abject poverty, we should make every effort to alleviate this problem first and foremost. There are people starving to death all across the world because they can't afford the necessities they need to survive. Beyond threatening food security, poverty also greatly exacerbates crime and facilitates human trafficking. Rural poverty in particular forces hundreds of thousands of women and girls to be sold into slavery every year. They have to be our priority. Case study 1, Estonia. A representative sample of how prioritizing economic growth reduces poverty is Estonia. Back in 1993, 84,000 Estonians lived on less than $3.10 a day. Because they chose a free market economy, Estonia saw massive growth in the following 15 years. By 2005, they eliminated extreme poverty, and 2 years later, they were no longer classified as a developing country. Estonia isn't an isolated example, however, and its experience can be demonstrated in almost every other country in the world. Case study 2, economic growth reduces poverty. For example, I'm about to read from a report published by the OECD Department of International Development that shows there is a clear link between saving lives by lifting people out of poverty and economic growth. Research that compares the experiences of a wide range of developing countries finds consistently strong evidence that rapid and sustained growth is the single most important way to reduce poverty. The central role of growth in driving the speed at which poverty declines is confirmed by research on individual countries and groups of countries. A flagship study of 14 countries in the 1990s found that over the course of the decade, poverty fell in the 11 countries that experienced significant growth and rose in the 3 countries with low or stagnant growth. Among these 14 countries, the reduction in poverty was particularly spectacular in Vietnam, where poverty fell by 7.8% a year between 1993 and 2002, halving the poverty rate from 58% to 29%. Other countries with impressive reductions over this period include El Salvador, Ghana, India, Tunisia, and Uganda, each with declines in the poverty rate of between 3 and 6% a year. This shows us clearly that we can solve the problem of poverty with economic growth and the reductions in poverty that it brings. The people of developing nations are the focus of this debate, and we cannot pass up our best opportunity to improve their quality of life. Contention 2, environmental protection obstructs quality of life. In the occurrences where economic growth and environmental protection conflict, we see that environmental protection becomes harmful as it's restricting our ability to lift people out of poverty. However, in many instances, choosing to prioritize environmental protection goes further to directly cause the suffering and death of millions. Application, malaria and DDT. The reckless environmental policies have been a major contributor to the resurgence of malaria and are endangering millions of lives in developing countries. Unfortunately, governments in developing countries have had a hard time choosing between saving lives and protecting the environment. Starting in 1972, the insecticide DDT was banned internationally because it allegedly drove some bird species to near extinction. This wouldn't be a problem, except that DDT was responsible for the near eradication of malaria by the 1960s. Because it kills the mosquitoes that spread malaria, its use was highly effective in stopping the disease. For example, in Madagascar, DDT spraying reduced cases of malaria by 90%, but the number of cases proliferated after DDT spraying stopped. In 1964, Sri Lanka had almost completely eliminated the disease, but it returned after DDT use was banned. As a result, malaria is now one of the most devastating diseases developing nations face. According to the World Health Organization, malaria kills over 500,000 people every single year. The majority of these deaths are children under the age of 5. When environmental protection is chosen in the real world, it means causing real problems. The millions of people dying from malaria annually need help, and banning an effective tool for stopping it will only further destroy quality of life. Undeveloped countries have the most developed problems. Developing countries need a focus that fixes the real problems facing them now: poverty and human suffering. Only by growing the economy can we change that. And that comes by voting F. Thank you.
So you got a timer, so we don't need to double up. All right, is everybody ready to begin? Excellent. Well, first off, congratulations on continuing to progress throughout the rounds at NITOC.
Thank you, and you too.
I just have a couple of questions about your case. First of all, you mentioned a criterion. Can you tell me again what that was under your value?
I didn't present a criterion
Oh,
under
okay.
my value.
I didn't know if you said criterion. So we're looking at quality of life as your value.
Yes.
Okay. Now you talked about under your first contention is application of Estonia, correct?
Yes.
And you're essentially saying that most people live on about $3 a day, but their economy's done quite well over the last few years.
No.
That's not what you're saying.
No.
Okay. Well, let's move on then to the burdens in this round. Let's talk about what your burden is. You would agree that it's your burden in order to demonstrate a priority, that economic growth is prioritized above the environment, correct?
It's my burden that show that economic growth should be prioritized over environmental protection in developing countries.
Right, it should be prioritized. Not just that economic growth is a good thing, but that it's actually prioritized to the detriment of environmental protection.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, let's talk about your analysis on OCD. You talked about the economy lowering the rates of poverty, correct?
Yes.
So this was just a study that said basically when the economy does better, as a general rule, poverty goes down, correct?
Well, not exactly. When the study said that when the economy does better, the most significant factor in decreasing poverty is, yes, economic growth. Now, if you'd like to see my data on the environmental protection of these countries, I'd be glad to give it to you.
But did you present any data about the environmental protection of these countries in your speech?
The part of the study that I quoted did not present data, but I do have it if you would like.
So you're saying that this study was directly analyzing environmental protection as well? Study from OCD?
Well, the purpose of the study wasn't to directly analyze environmental protection, no.
Okay, so there was no conflict under that study?
Actually, there was conflict underneath the study, but we're talking about the countries, because the countries themselves that were presented did not actually, neglected the environment as a result. If you'd like to see data on the current environmental,
right. If I can bring you back to my question, you said that the OCD study was not directly looking at environmental protection, correct?
It wasn't directly looking at environmental protection, but if you would like to see the data on the environmental situation in these countries, I will give it to you.
Well, let's talk about your application of malaria. You mentioned how DDT is a very useful chemical, and you said that it can harm the wildlife, correct?
Yes, it harmed bird species, and that's why it was banned.
Are you aware that according to National Geographic, the use of the chemical DDT is linked to a 4-fold increase in breast cancer?
Well, are you aware that the CDC disagrees?
The CDC doesn't disagree.
Well, I have data on that if you'd like.
That was back in the 1990s when they first launched studies. They couldn't prove a direct link, but when you have more recent evidence coming from just last year, we find that National Geographic shows it. But let's go back to a couple questions I have for you. Let's talk about alternatives to DDT. You would agree there are things like mosquito nets and other pesticides that are alternatives to DDT that can be used, correct?
There are alternatives, but they haven't been nearly as effective as DDT.
They haven't been as effective?
They haven't been nearly as effective.
Okay. No further questions? Here's your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Starting prep time. 1 minute and 36 seconds remaining. I'm just going to write that down. Everybody ready? Haley Tamago's life changed forever at the age of 2. She was diagnosed with leukemia, a cancer that used to be deadly but is now treatable through medicines found in the rainforest. Haley and thousands like her are still alive today because the environment was prioritized above the economy. That is why I oppose this resolution. Let's go over one point of resolutional analysis, which is that the priority is the burden. Priority is the burden. You'll notice the affirmative has a burden in this round to prove a priority, that economic growth should be prioritized above environmental protection. What this means is the affirmative can't just demonstrate isolated examples of when economic growth has been good. He actually needs to establish that we're prioritizing it to the detriment of environmental protection. With that said, let's go over the value. I'm going to agree with my opponent's value of quality of life. However, the only way you achieve quality of life is by first protecting the environmental resources that enable life to exist. Let's go over my first contention, which is that economic prioritization harms human life. Economic prioritization harms human life. We can see this through the application of pollution. The Global Alliance on Health and Pollution reported that water, air, and soil pollution is the leading cause of death in developing countries. In 2012, 8.4 million deaths were a result of just the pollution occurring in those developing countries. Now, this occurs because many of these countries are prioritizing their economic growth over basic environmental stewardship. Take China, for instance. They have one of the world's largest economies, yet in 2012, their air pollution alone resulted in 1.2 million premature deaths. You see, when we look at pollution and how it affects developing countries, it affects the most basic of needs. When there's water pollution and you can't have a clean drink of water, that affects malnourishment. When the water is contaminated, it means the crops you grow are now more likely to give diseases to the people. So all of these things contribute and demonstrate that unless you protect the most basic necessities of life, you can never have an economy at all. Let's go over my second contention, which is that environmental prioritization benefits human life. Environmental prioritization benefits human life. I have two subpoints under this argument. The first one is that of pharmaceutical medicine. The Amazon rainforest is becoming an incredible contributor of new cures and medicines. Over 100 pharmaceutical companies are researching plants in the Amazon in order to develop new life-saving medications for infections, cancer, and AIDS. In fact, 25% of Western pharmaceuticals are derived from something in the Amazon, yet we've only studied 1% of the plants that are there. You see, it's only when Brazil first protects the Amazon rainforest and protects their environment that over the long term, we're enabling all of these medicines to exist that save countless lives. My second subpoint is that of the periwinkle plant. The periwinkle plant comes from Madagascar, and it's enabled the development of a life-saving medicine that treats childhood leukemia. Now, before the medicine was introduced, 90% of children who got leukemia died from it. But after the medicine, the statistic completely reversed itself. Now, 95% of children who get leukemia actually survive. See, this medicine has saved countless lives, but only because that plant was first protected. That was the first priority of the developing nation. Additionally, though, this plant has also enabled the development of an entire new economic industry because the medicine companies can now sell all these medicines they're making. So when the environment comes first, it enables more economic growth in the long term and greater protection of human rights. Let's go over a few arguments my opponent was making. He talked about what a developing country is. I agree. We can also look, though, at the Economic Development Administration's list for more specifics. Under his value of quality of life, I agree, but it's only achieved through the environment that enables medicines to exist and clean water to exist. Under his first contention, he said that growth enables quality of life. I have two overarching responses to this entire contention. The first is that good does not equal priority. My opponent is essentially arguing that the economy is great, and I agree, the economy is great. However, that's not the question of the resolution. The resolution is one of priority. For instance, if I was trying to prove that human comfort should be prioritized above human life, I couldn't just tell you how amazing human comfort was, because I wouldn't actually be showing the conflict in the resolution. Now you'll notice under all my opponent's applications, he never demonstrated this conflict. Now he may try to come up in his next speech and bring up new analysis under it, but he has to meet the burden of the resolution in his first constructive speech. And if he hasn't shown the conflict in his first constructive speech, then there's no way he can win the debate round. So that's the second response of a failed burden. He hasn't shown conflict, he's only proving the economy's good, and we all agree to that. He talked about how poverty is bad, and he brought up Estonia, an OCD study. Again, existence does not equal priority. But let's go over his second contention, where he said that the environment harms human life. My first response is this is empirically denied in two ways. First, through 25% of Western pharmaceuticals. That's protecting millions of lives, and it only comes from environmental protection. Secondly, pollution is the leading cause of death, and that's the result of my opponent's philosophy. He also talked about the application of DDT. Two responses. The first, DDT causes cancer. According to the National Geographic, just in 2015, they reported that new studies show that there's a 4-fold increase in cancer, breast cancer specifically, because of DDT. The second response is that there's alternatives. There's alternatives such as other pesticides and mosquito nets that can be used to accomplish the same task. So it's not a question of, do we kill all these people by prioritizing the environment, but do we use maybe a slightly more costly chemical to stop breast cancer and also protect all of these people? You're always going to prioritize keeping people healthy over a couple more dollars in your pocket. My third response to under his point that developing countries need economic growth as a foundation is that the environment is the foundation. See, when we talk about environmental protection in America, we think about disputed science like climate change. But for developing countries, environmental protection is about, do I have clean water to drink? Are my crops going to be contaminated and give me a disease? Can I breathe without wearing a mask? Until you solve the prerequisite issue of the environment first, there's no way you can have a healthy people capable of even engaging in the economy.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your first contention. You talk about how the economic prioritization harms human life. Your example is pollution, correct?
Right, I'm talking about pollution, not just air pollution, but water, soil.
All right, so what's the what's the source that you cited for that statistic?
There's a couple sources. So I believe the specific China number comes from the New York Times.
All right, what was the other one?
And the one for developing countries, I believe there's one from Cornell. And I can get them to you during the break if you want all of them. I have about
all right, what was
sources,
the methodology of the Cornell study?
With the methodology of the Cornell study, that wasn't one I specifically talked about in my speech. That's just one that shows 40% of all deaths worldwide are contributed to by.
All right, so you said 8.4 million deaths in developing countries. What was the source on that?
I can have it on my table if you want me to.
What was the methodology of the study?
The methodology of the study is that we're looking at developing countries and we're going to see whether the terrible water that they're drinking is affecting their lifespans, which it clearly is. Whether breathing smoke-filled air on a constant basis is going to give you respiratory problems.
How did these studies determine that these people died from these from polluted waters?
Right, a lot of these studies are several hundred pages long, but to give you like a sentence of what they did, they're looking at the diseases that are coming in individuals and also the conditions that people are living in to determine the depths of pollution.
So they're observational studies?
Not just observational. I mean, they're looking at how pollution affects individuals. So I mean, I guess you're observing to an extent, if that's what you're asking.
All right, so you're looking at individuals, looking at the health effects, and then deciding whether or not that was caused by pollution?
No, I mean, in part you're doing that. However, we're looking at how pollution affects the individual. I mean, you can show a link between constantly drinking polluted water and a disease that you may one day get.
It's terrific. Now let's talk about pharmaceutical medicines and periwinkle plant. You said that increased economic growth, right?
The pharmaceutical plant?
The periwinkle plant.
Right, the periwinkle plant did, but only because the environment came first. The developing country had to first protect the Amazon rainforest. If they didn't do that and allowed more deforestation, those plants wouldn't exist.
So it's your position that we're talking about whichever thing comes first, correct?
Well, we're talking about what comes first for developing countries and is therefore the most important for them.
All right, terrific. Now let's talk a little bit about how your DDT staff. You said that DDT kills. That was from the National Geographic, correct?
National Geographic 2015 is the most recent study out there, but it's not just Nat Geo doing their own study. They're actually reporting, I believe, from the World Health Organization, though I can check it if you want.
All right. So what was the methodology of that study?
Right, the methodology is the same idea. We're
Okay,
looking at how
terrific.
DDT has, did you want to know, or?
No.
Okay.
If you say it's the same idea, then I understand exactly what you're
Oh, it's
talking
not the same as pollution. The studies are conducted completely differently.
All right, well,
They're still
no-
observational, but if
We're
we're looking
running
at
out of time,
pollution.
so let's just
or
move on.
Okay.
So when we're talking about poverty reduction, you would agree with me that economic growth does reduce poverty, correct? That was your point in response to my first contention.
Right, but if you have people who can't drink clean water, you're having major malnourishment, which also contributes to poverty. So I don't think you have the link on economic growth will always decrease poverty. I think as a general rule, yeah, the economy's good. But the question is, if people can't survive, then why does it even matter?
All right, so when we're talking about the medicine, you're saying that essentially environmental protection led to these medicinal innovations.
Right, environmental protection came first, and therefore it's most important.
Okay, thank you. 3 minutes starting now. Used up 1 minute and 35 seconds of time.
That's
Right.
correct.
Huh?
Oh, I just said that's correct.
Oh. All right. 4 minutes. Ready? All right, starting now. I'm going to start right at the top with my points resolutional analysis point of priority is the burden. I'm going to agree to this value. I do have to show priority in today's resolution. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you exactly how economic growth should be prioritized over environmental protection by, once again, moving to my first contention. My first contention talked about how economic growth improves quality of life. Now, my opponent's first response to this was that good doesn't equal priority. And he addressed both my case studies under this, saying that I never actually showed you priority in my first speech. However, I did actually show you priority, and you can tag my response as priority shown. Priority shown. The clearest example of priority was in my example of Estonia. I showed you that they had a free market economy, meaning that they rejected regulations and they rejected the environment during the period of development. They didn't even create an environmental protection agency until the year of 2010. That was already 3 years after they'd already become a developed nation. Ultimately, priority was shown of economic growth over the environment. Now, in regards to the second case study, I didn't show priority directly within the case study that I quoted, but however, every single country that I mentioned is on the lower half of the Yale's Environmental Protection Index, meaning that over half the world, the best of these countries in regards to protecting the environment, over half the world is doing better than them. Ultimately, this shows us clearly that yes, they prioritize economic growth over environmental protection. In both of these examples, poverty was reduced. My opponent's next response talked a lot about how you can't have poverty, you can't improve people's quality of life without clean water, but there's ultimately no conflict to this because my opponent hasn't actually shown you how economic growth will destroy our ability to use clean water. Now let me move down into my opponent's responses to my second contention. My second contention showed you environmental protection destroys quality of life because of 2 reasons. First, it conflicts with economic growth, and thus it conflicts with our ability to lift people out of poverty. And second thing, it kills people with reckless environmental policies like malaria and DDT. Now, his first response was that this was empirically denied mind because of the medicine, I'm just going to cross-apply my future responses to his second contention. That's something for you guys to look forward to. Next, in regards to malaria and DDT, my opponent says that DDT kills people, that it causes cancer, but it doesn't actually kill people. According to the Center for Disease Control in 2009, there's actually no evidence to show that DDT kills people. In fact, it's known by the EPA as mildly toxic, which is basically the same as vinegar. If you drink it, you're going to puke. That's what DDT is. It doesn't actually cause cancer, it doesn't actually kill. Now my opponent says that environmental protection is foundational. So let's take a look. Is environmental protection foundational? Well, his first contention talks about how economic priority harms human life, but his only example of this was pollution. Well, you can tag my response to pollution as no solvency. No solvency. And I'm going to have two subpoints under this. The first subpoint you can tag as regulations are complex. Regulations are complex. When we're talking about pollution, we're talking about something that takes a lot of money and institutional resources to actually solve. To identify air pollution, you need to identify the source, and that doesn't happen without a large team of scientists and a lot of equipment. That isn't solved by prioritizing environmental protection over economic growth. Well, it's actually solved by the priority of economic growth over environmental protection, which brings me to a second subpoint, which you can tag as growth solves. Growth solves. Ultimately, pollution is somewhat caused by economic growth, but economic growth is what solves the problem. Economic growth is what gives us the institutional resources that are necessary to actually fix the problem, to actually stop pollution. That's what we see in developed nations right now, and that's what we see underneath this example of China as well. China is no longer a developing nation underneath my definition. In fact, when they grew acid, not that it was a developing nation. It didn't prioritize economic growth. The reason was because my definition said both GDP and GPC. Look on the back of your shirt. If the tag probably says that it was made in China. The people in China are living in poverty right now. Their GDP increased, but their GPC didn't. Therefore, it wasn't economic growth. Now, in regards to my opponent's, both of my opponent's applications underneath the second contention, you can tag my response as no conflict, because ultimately he hasn't been able to show how environmental protection is prioritized over economic growth, and I challenge him to do that. Thank you.
All right. I have a minute 36 starting now. Ready? Let's begin. It's because my opponent is only demonstrating that economies should exist, but not that economic growth gets a priority to the detriment of environmental protection, that I would urge you to vote for the negative side. Let's go over first his contention 1, where I said that good doesn't equal a priority, but he said that he showed the priority. My response is he failed to show the priority. If we look at his study, he said in cross-examination there was no environmental policy analysis in this entire study. But secondly, he also said, look, all these developing countries are low on the environmental index. My response, though, is that all developing countries are low on this index because they're developing. There's no way they're competing with developed nations. He hasn't actually shown what the policies are in these specific countries. If that was true, then my opponent would be saying that every single developing country that exists right now is prioritizing their economy, and that's just simply not the case. He also talked about how the free market existed in Estonia. My response is existence does not equal priority. Of course a free market existed, of course that's a good thing, however that doesn't mean you're showing a priority over the environment. But more importantly, he hasn't shown how we're achieving quality of life. He's only shown that when economies do well, maybe poverty can drop. But he's never solved for the drinking water that's polluted or the people who are starving to death because their crops are contaminated and they can't eat them. Let's go over his analysis on DDT. He brought up the CDC study from 2009. My response, June 16th, 2015, the more recent study from National Geographic shows that there's a new link between DDT and a 4-fold increase in breast cancer. But my second response is he conceded my alternatives. There's alternatives to DDT that can be used that do the exact same thing, however they might cost a little bit more. But that's the inherent flaw with the economy side of this resolution. He's saying that we should prioritize a few more dollars in your pocket over not having people get cancer and saving all of these lives. So this application actually shows you the importance of protecting the environment and protecting health. Now, under my point about how the environment is the foundation, he talked about pollution. So let's go there on my first contention under pollution. He said there's no solvency and that regulations don't work. Group these, I have one response, which is don't dump sewage. It's not that complicated to tell a company, don't dump your toxic waste into the river where 5 miles down the stream people are trying to get a drink. That's what we're talking about here. But my second response here is it's empirically denied, because he said that growth solves. Basically, once we have enough money, then pollution will kind of solve for itself. But that's empirically denied through China. They have one of the world's largest economies, and yet their pollution standards are terrible. In response to China, he said, though, there's a difference between GDP and per capita income. My response is that both increased. In China, over the last 30 years, when they had their economic policies, both GDP and GPC have increased, yet we've seen how the environment has been harmed because of it. Now, I know my opponent is going to come back in his next speech, and he's going to talk about pollution and say, look, the economy is the only way to solve it. When he says that, remember that it's empirically denied by the world's largest economy, which contributes to 1.2 million deaths every single year. Ultimately, he hasn't also shown how the economy is going to solve for the person right now who can't get a clean drink of water. Are we going to wait 40 years while that person dies in order to fix the problem? We can't do that. The prerequisite issue is always going to be protecting health over protecting a new factory 10 miles down the street. Let's go over my second contention. He said there was no conflict. My one response, no warrant. He provided no warrant on why the conflict didn't exist. What this means is he's essentially conceded this entire contention. The contention that demonstrated when we prioritize the environment, we get 25% of Western pharmaceuticals. That's the medicines that you and I use, and it's the medicines that save millions in developing countries. Additionally, at the point he's conceded this, he's kind of conceded the round because that's the biggest impact to human life. So let's go over a few voting issues. The first voting issue is that of a failed burden. A failed burden. My opponents failed the burden in this round in two separate ways. The first is that good does not equal priority. He's going to come up in his next speech and say, look, I've shown you the conflict, here's where it is, here's a study. When he says that, I want you to remember that it's his burden in a debate round to demonstrate that conflict within the first affirmative constructive speech. Because otherwise, an affirmative could just say some things and then fill it all out later. He can't shift ground. He has to show the burden in the first speech. The second reason he's failing his burden is he's failing quality of life. Because even under all his applications, they're vastly outweighed by the leading cause of death in developing countries and the 25% of Western pharmaceuticals which only exist when the environment is prioritized. My second voting issue, the environment is the foundation. My opponent never adequately addressed my core analysis, which is if you're living in a developing country, you care about whether you have clean water to drink, not whether there's a new manufacturing warehouse being built 20 miles from your house. You care about whether the food you're growing is filled with contaminants or not, or whether you can breathe clean air. So until you solve that prerequisite, foundational issue, there's no way you can even have people who are healthy enough to engage in the economy. My third voting issue is the empirics. My opponent will come up in his next speech and he's probably going to talk about his application, the one country he brought up that had an economy, and he's going to talk about DDT. But when he does that, remember that DDT is linked to a 4-fold increase in breast cancer. It's by prioritizing the environment that we actually develop and use the safer alternatives that save health. So he's actually contradicting his value here because he's purporting something that harms it. But secondly, he's going to talk about pollution. When he does, remember that the solution is simply don't dump sewage in the ocean, don't dump sewage in the river that people have to drink from. My final voting issue, the environment protects human life. If you're living in a developing country, you're going to care about health and life. That's the prerequisite.
1 minute and 25 seconds, starting now. Jeremy Bentham once said, "The government has but a choice of evils." In this debate round, you have been presented with two sides of a debate, both sides with positive impacts and both sides with negative consequences. My opponent presented the applications of pharmaceutical medicines in the Periwinkle plan, 25% of modern or Western pharmaceuticals, he said. And he was right. I didn't provide a warrant. But that isn't enough to negate the resolution. My opponent in his last speech said that I failed the affirmative burden because my first contention didn't provide any conflict in my first speech, but I actually did provide conflict in my first speech, chiefly with the example of Estonia, an example that my opponent didn't directly respond to. My opponent says that over and over again that I have to demonstrate conflict, but over and over again, I have demonstrated conflict. I showed with the Environmental Protection Index that every single country that lifted its people out of poverty in the OECD study did so by neglecting the environment. I showed you in the example of Estonia that they chose a free market economy and they didn't even start implementing environmental regulations until 2010. I showed you, yes, there was conflict, and that is huge. It shows us that quality of life is met by the affirmative side. It shows us that we lift people out of poverty, and I'm going to ask you this. While people are living in poverty, can they have good quality of life? My answer to that is no. But my opponent disagrees. He says that because of pollution, they don't have a good quality of life, even if they are lifted out of poverty. But I already showed you, there is no solvency. The regulations are complex. You can't actually implement that without the institutional necessities that economic growth provides. My opponent didn't directly respond to it. All he said was, don't dump sewage. That it's empirically denied because it's bad to wait 40 years for a solution. But ultimately, 40 years is what we'll have to wait. And it will be longer than that if we negate the resolution because we won't have the institutional necessities actually necessary to fix the problem. In regards to how they both, so ultimately what we've seen here is that there is absolutely no solvency to negate the resolution. My opponent hasn't shown you how developing nations have the sufficient capabilities to actually solve pollution, and ultimately only economic growth does that because it gives these nations the money and the resources that make them able to actually solve this problem. So ultimately, at the end of the day, my only voting issue you can tag as economic growth improves quality of life and environmental protection doesn't. Because what we're seeing here is a clear conflict. Only a prioritization of economic growth will lift people out of poverty. That is what I showed you with my applications. My opponents, the only thing that my opponent says outweighs that is pollution, something solved by economic growth, not environmental protection, and the pharmaceutical medicines, which absolutely does not outweigh the millions of people dying every single year from the negative consequences of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to judge.
Thank you very much for judging.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for judging. Thank you very much for taking the time to judge.